Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Jess Lenore in Baltimore. President-elect Donald Trump has revealed his pick for Education Secretary, billionaire heiress Betsy Devos. The right-wing charter school advocate was chosen after Jerry Falwell said he turned down the post. Also in the running was disgraced former head of D.C. schools Michelle Rhee. In September, Trump proposed the government spend $20 billion to expand school choice through vouchers and increase charter schools. Here's that clip.
School choice is at the center of the civil rights agenda. And my goal is to provide every single inner city child in America that is trapped in a failing government school the freedom to attend the school of their choice. Competition, the schools will get better and better and better. And that means a private school, a religious school, a charter school, or a magnet school can homeschool their children.
That's Donald Trump in September talking about his plan to spend $20 billion to expand school vouchers and school choice. Well, now joining us to discuss this from Plainfield, New Jersey is Glen Ford. Glen is the co-founder and executive editor of the Black Agenda Report. Thanks so much for joining us, Glen.
Thanks for having me.
So, Glen, we just heard Donald Trump outline his vision for school vouchers. Giving the parents the choice to decide where to send their kids, whether it be a private school, a parochial school, a charter school, magnet school. And he has picked Betsy Devos to implement those policies, someone who's had her hands in education policy for decades. And we'll get to that. But talk about the history of the private school movement, and as well as the issue of school choice and vouchers. Talk about where that comes from and its history.
Yeah, well, DeVos is part of what we might call the old school of the privatization folks, whereas the newer school of privatization is represented by Barack Obama. And now we see those two schools kind of coming together under President Trump's administration, at least that seems that way. DeVos was part of that old school, the fat cat contributors to the private school voucher movement. But the private school voucher movement was anathema in most of black political circles because it was so closely identified. In fact, it grew out of the segregation academy movement. That is, those private schools that were set up all over the South in order to avoid public school desegregation. And not just in the South, but also in western parts of Michigan, which is where DeVos is from, and that's where her branch of the school voucher movement came from.
And you're talking about in response to Brown versus Board of Education.
Brown versus Board of Education. In the South, whole counties shut down their school systems and then immediately opened up private schools for the white kids to go to, and then launched a movement to fund those private schools with public school dollars. In fact, they embezzled, siphoned off plenty of public funds in order to do that in various localities for a while. They also hooked up with elements of the Catholic Church in order to resuscitate, revive the Catholic Church's private school systems. But it didn't catch on in Black America because Black folks knew where that came from. In fact, it was so unpopular that you could only find one member of the Congressional Black Caucus before the turn of the 21st century who supported private school vouchers. One of the exceptions in terms of Black politicians who supported school vouchers was Cory Booker, who was a school voucher advocate in Newark, New Jersey. He now, of course, is a U.S. Senator. And he was one of the founding members of this Black Alliance for Educational Options that was set up by DeVos and the Walton family, another bunch of fat cat contributors to privatization of schools by all means, and a whole bunch of of right-wing corporate personalities. They funded this Black Alliance for educational options in order to make inroads in the Black community for private school vouchers. And Cory Booker was part of that. Corporations poured millions of dollars into it. And in 2000, George Bush was elected president, and he put this Black Alliance on the federal payroll, and more millions of dollars came into their pockets. But Black people were still resisting private school vouchers, and therefore it wasn't a very effective strategy, because the goal was always on making some kind of inroads in the inner city schools. Remember, suburban schools are well funded, and the parents of students there don't see any need for any kind of programs like that. So the focus was always on Black America, and the focus became not on school vouchers, with all the resistance that that resulted, but on charters. And the political clout shifted from the Republicans to fat cat Democrats, and especially folks on Wall Street, but also Bill Gates and lots of people from Silicon Valley. They liked the idea of charter schools because that was a way to reach a whole bunch of folks without such political resistance, and changed the curriculum and in fact, the very purpose of schooling in ways that were better suited, they thought, to the needs of their corporations. And one of the new group of Black corporate Democrats that were in favor of charter schools was Barack Obama. And when he came in, he became the champion of all time of privatization through charters, through his Race to the Top program.
And I think it's important for people to be reminded that Race to the Top did way more to expand charter schools than No Child Left Behind ever could do. And that was one of the few things where Obama could get the Republicans on his side, and many Democrats, to some extent, opposed that initiative.
It was the grand bargain that he was seeking in the educational arena. And it coerced states to raise the ceilings that many of them had placed on the number of charter schools that they would allow on their territory, or else they would lose these bonus billions of federal funding from Race to the Top. So he was magic for the charter school movement. And so what we're seeing here is an amalgam, a merging under the Trump administration of these fantastic successes in terms of penetration, not necessarily in terms of education, but successes in terms of penetration of public education by charters, and now a revival of the old school of private school vouchers as federal policy under Devos. You can thank both Devos and Barack Obama for the further privatization of education in this country.
I think it's interesting because I want to bring up the example of Detroit, which has a charter school program which is a complete disaster. There's been a huge amount of community outcry over the condition of those schools. And it was reported by the Detroit Metro Times this past summer that Devos and her family gave thousands to lawmakers to block increased accountability of that charter school system. Her family is a major, longtime funder of the Republican Party. In 1997, she admitted her family is the single largest contributor of soft money to the Republican Party. Her brother is Eric Prince, the founder of the private mercenary company Blackwater, which is a whole nother topic we can get into. But I wanted to briefly go back to the issue of Newark, New Jersey, where Cory Booker was mayor. Because and you talked about the philanthropic world giving money, especially Silicon Valley, and that's where Mark Zuckerberg invested $100 million. And you talked about corporate Black Democrats. He announced that with Oprah Winfrey, and Chris Christie was there, on the Oprah Winfrey show. And that money, the question of where that $100 million went, became a huge issue in Newark. And it became part of the election between when Booker went to the Senate, the election between Ras Baraka and his opponent.
And a Booker clone.
Yeah, Shavar Jeffries, who was a big charter school opponent. And we saw it there in Newark, where the people sided with Baraka and voted him in against this huge influx of money from Jeffries and his backers. And as we talked before the interview, charter schools have, were set back in elections and in ballot initiatives around the country in this election.
Yes, in Massachusetts, it was question 2, and 2/3 of the voters rejected charter schools. And what was important here is that they didn't just reject bad charter schools, they rejected charter schools as such, because very few of the charter schools in Massachusetts are ranked among the worst. But the schools in Michigan, with people like Devos protecting them, are ranked among the worst. They are as close to private schools as she can get them while still getting public funding. In other words, she is still shooting for her ideal of no state involvement in education. That's her philosophical objective.
And so what that means is no accountability. And we hear of these scandals with charter schools kicking out students, being completely fake. Like, families would show up for days at a time or weeks at a time, and there would be a school on paper, but none there. But there's the bigger issue, I think, where because there is an appeal for charter schools, and especially in urban America, because people look at the public school system and they say, like, I don't want to send my kid to that neighborhood school. So let's talk about some solutions about what can be done about the public education system in this country. Bernie Sanders had an interesting proposal: delink public school funding from property taxes, because that's the root of this inequity in many ways. Because for example, in Chicago, schools outside of the city boundary in the suburbs, the wealthy suburbs, will get like twice the amount of funding in some cases.
Well, of course, the delinking with property taxes has to be there because there are obviously limits to what poor communities can do in terms of subsidizing their public schools. But everything has to begin with community control of schools, and whatever budgets are available, that the people decide, have a role in how those monies are spent, and not these corporate architects of education that are in the catbird seat, both under private school vouchers and under the kind of charter school formulas that the Obama administration's been pushing.
And it's worth mentioning that in some cities like Chicago, they do have local school councils where parents are directly involved, and those type of councils get removed when schools get privatized or made into charters. So there are models that exist around the country where parents are directly involved, either on a local level or on a citywide level. But we'll definitely have to keep continuing this conversation. Thanks so much for joining us again, Glen Ford.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us at the Real News Network.